Good evening and welcome to Museums on the Arts, a conversation that is especially relevant in today's context when museums, their audiences, and the community at large are re examining the role that institutions have played traditionally. We at MAP are acutely aware that art is not just about objects that are displayed in museums. Art is also our tangible and intangible heritage. It is about the visual arts as much as it is about music, dance, theatre, performance. It is about our culture and how it has integrated seamlessly into our lives over hundreds of years. It is also about the interdependence of the arts in India and how each enriches the other. Now more than ever, when we see the devastation that the pandemic has wrought on lives, particularly artist communities, where there has been little organizational support for these groups, it is time for museums to expand their roles to see how they can provide the platforms that help the arts revive and thrive. Because we are now beginning to recognize the role that the arts play in human well-being. And so today we have brought together a wonderful panel of speakers who have each in their own way helped build an ecosystem that enables the arts to flourish, whether it is through a theatre, a foundation, or a festival. And that is why we at MAP see MAP as a cultural hub that will draw people to its spaces through ideas, conversations, and through the platforms it provides for the intersection of the arts as a whole. And so I would now like to hand you over to Vinod Daniel, the moderator for the evening. Vinod is an integral part of the MAP family as a member of our advisory board. He is chair of the Australian International Cultural Heritage Network, AusHeritage, and a board member of ICOM, the International Council of Museums. He has worked on museum projects in over 60 countries, published and presented over 100 papers. Vinod, over to you.
Thanks, Kamini and the Museum of Art and Photography. So can I now request all the panelists to maybe turn your videos on if you can and join in? Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Museums have played a significant role in preserving, promoting, and displaying the arts. But they also have a very important role in supporting the arts and artists, especially within the local environment. Among other aspects, this panel discussion will explore how museums, especially in India, can work closely with the art community, including the performing arts. How can museums assist in cultural rejuvenation, become hubs of creativity, and use their collections to rejuvenate arts that are disappearing? And finally, what should be the role of museums in preserving and supporting collections outside their spaces? We have a great panel today consisting of people who have a connection with museums, but also focus on the broader domain, including cultural festivals, performing arts, and theatre. Trust the perspectives they share will be of interest to Indian museums as they broaden the thinking on what a museum is. Now, let me briefly introduce the panelists. Sanjoy K. Roy, he's the managing director for the Jaipur Literature Festival. Sanjoy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamworks Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals across 40 cities in several countries, including the world's largest free literary gathering, the annual Jaipur Literature Festival. Roy has received the National Award for Excellence and Best Director for the film Shah Jahan Bad, The Twilight Years. He's a founder trustee of Salam Balak Trust. In 2011, the White House presented Salam Balak Trust the US President's Committee of Arts and Humanities Award for an international organization. Roy works closely with various industry bodies and government on policy issues within the creative industries and cultural sector in India, and is a senior office bearer on several committees working on policy infrastructure for the creative industry. Sanjna Kapoor is well known for a passionate work with theatre over 2 decades and for having built Prithvi Theatre into one of India's premier cultural hubs. She is responsible for having brought to Indian audiences some of the finest of world and Indian theatre, being the first to introduce a touring theatre festival into the Indian scene. She has also played a key role as a catalyst for theatre for children. She co-founded Junoon and spearheaded Junoon's school program and continued the legacy of both the Kapoors and the Kendalls to take theatre to people across the country. Sanjna has been responsible for initiating the India Theatre Forum Network for theatre practitioners. In 2020, Sanjna was awarded the Chevalier d'Ansley Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, a knighthood conferred by the Ministry of Culture, Government of France, in recognition of significant contribution to the arts, literature, and the propagation of these fields. Our third panelist, Karni Singh Jasol. He is the director of Mehrangarh Museum Trust in Jodhpur. Karni has served as project advisor and organizing curator of Peacock in the Desert, the Royal Arts of Jodhpur, which featured at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Seattle Art Museum, Seattle, and the Royal Ontario Museum, Toronto. Mr. Jasol has been the recipient of several awards, including the Charles Wallace Award for a study on the collection management and storage systems of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the Nehru Trust Award for a study on museum education in Indian museums. He's a recipient of the Fulbright Fellowship and worked at the Freer and Sackler Galleries of the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. He co-curated the critically acclaimed exhibition Garden and the Cosmos, the Royal Paintings of Jodhpur, for which he received the prestigious Alfred Barr Award of the College Arts Association. Preeti Vasudevan, founder and artistic director for Thresh, is an award-winning Indian choreographer, performer, and educator. Preeti is an exponent of classical Indian dance Bharatanatyam, creating new provocative contemporary works from the Indian tradition. She is a founder and artistic director of Thresh, a performing arts collaborative that creates experimental productions, fostering provocative dialogues around questions of identity and our collective relationship with heritage, cultures, and contemporary lives. Preeti is on the 2020 Artistic Committee of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York. We have 4 eminent panelists, and what I'll do now is kind of brief a little bit in terms of how the evening would be. I'm going to request each of the panelists to speak for 4 minutes. After that, I'll open up with a few questions from my end. I'll request the audiences to type in your questions. If you're following us through Zoom, please type in the chat box. If you're doing through Facebook Live, please type in your questions there. And I'll request then the audiences to answer some of them. So I'll put it across to the audiences. So I'll first request Sanjoy to make your opening comments, and he'll be followed by Karni, Sanjna, and then Preeti. Sanjoy.
Thank you, Vinod, and thank you, Kamini, and congratulations, MAP. I think all of us are waiting for this new addition to the creative cultural landscape of India, and the sooner we get it up and running, the better. So many congratulations in advance and for setting up the series of conversations. In our discussion yesterday, pre this, Vinod sort of said that let's look at some of what and how museums can help. And I wanted to focus primarily on, I mean, we all know that museums are in many ways the vehicle for knowledge and information and all our tangible assets and, you know, history, etc. What is less known is that our association or museums association would bringing about the possibility of social change. And that's what I thought, you know, I would spend my 2 or 3 minutes talking about. just giving you a couple of examples of what one has seen. So the most recent example was, in fact, at MoMA, where they did an exhibition, which was in the foyer, for those of you who may have traveled into it, where they looked at migration. And as you know, as bodies kept washing up onto the shores of the Mediterranean across Europe, there was this whole hue and cry of, where are these people? Who are these people? And in a project that Harvard Humanities Center, Dr. Homi Bhabha and we got involved in, was like, what are the rights of the dead? Do the dead have a right? Because these people who washed up onto the shores of the Mediterranean, they were picked up by the local municipality, dumped in mass graves, and you didn't actually know who they were. And back home, from wherever they may have come from, Afghanistan or the Punjab or Libya or Syria or wherever, there was no closure. So it started from that, and then MoMA did this beautiful a project where they put up a screen in the foyer, and you could go and look at the map and trace people who had migrated across different routes from Punjab via Bangladesh, on a ship, on a boat, through to Africa, through to Sets, and then on a boat from there. And you stood there, you could wear a headphone and listen to each story of each of these visitations. And it really brought home to you the issue at hand. Similarly, in Vinod's earlier stint, in Western Australia and Perth, the then Minister of Interiors in Western Australia, because of my work with Salam Balak Trust, wanted to know how Western Australia and its cultural and the museum there could look at changing the lives of Aboriginal people. And, we're talking about 2000, I think it was 2003 or 4. So my only request to the minister was that let the University of Perth also be involved to actually map and document the process of what we were doing. Obviously the museum and we did a fairly simple project. They identified a community in 100-kilometer radius outside of Kalgoorlie, which, as you know, many of you may know, is the deepest open mine in the world, and you can see it from space. And with that community, which was, I think, 15 different Aboriginal communities, what we said is that we'd create an open installation and let them tell their stories of the stars and the moon and the water, all the stories that they knew using local material. And our only this thing was that check in terms of let the truck carrying local groceries, the weekly groceries, and the dole truck go out to the community every week rather than them coming into town. This lot of people, as many of you may know or not know, 2% of Australia's population is Aboriginal. 98% of Australia's prison population is Aboriginal. In this area, it was 100%. That means cradle to grave, people had been incarcerated, baby to old person. 6 months later, of course, this particular project, because of the size of it, you could only see if you were in a helicopter. But the incidence rate of incarceration had come down to 27% from 100%. Now, this is not rocket science stuff. I'm going to end with another example because I'm conscious that Vinod is going to ask me to shut down. Is look at what it is, what we do in India. The Chola bronzes in Chennai. I don't know whether any of you have been to the museum which hosts the Chennai bronzes. It's a dusty little place. The guy will come in a cycle, open the lock, put some lights on if you insist, and you can see the Chola bronzes. The same Chola bronzes, when they traveled to London to the Royal Academy of the Arts, had a waiting line 2 blocks long and sold out every day that it was there. It had 24 Chola bronzes. One of the things that we have to look at, and I hope this panel will look at, is the role of museums and their valued existence or coexistence with communities. And how does museums and communities coexist beyond what we know as just being a place for historical objects? But it's not, because it's a place for the living, peopled by the living. It's not just a living place for knowledge and information, but it's really about the relationship of home, of identity, of tradition, of knowledge, and a DNA that we in India know, at least for ourselves, where all of us come from a DNA stamped where culture is part of that, from, again, birth to death. So I'm going to stop with that, and then we'll answer some more questions when Vinod poses it to us.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy, for your opening comments. Can I now invite Karni to give your opening comments, please?
Yeah, thank you, Map, and thank you, Vinod, and other panelists for this very interesting evening. I thought I'll bring in an insider's perspective. I'm a museum curator and a museum director of a historic site in Jodhpur, which is also a museum visited by over 1 million visitors. And we have sort of several experiences to share, which would provide the Indian context. Yes, we were primarily instituted to run a museum in a 15th century fort in Jodhpur. And when I joined the museum in 2000, there were two identities. There was the fort and there was the museum. In fact, there used to be a gate which used to say entry to the museum. And we sort of, slowly sort of, eroded that boundary. And we realized that it is a singular experience of visiting the fort. But apart from our classic activities of a museum, which are partially known to everyone, I would encourage everyone to visit our website, mehrangarh.org, to know our activities and bring my comment relevant to today's discussion of how museums can be hub of creativity, how they can be the epicenter of the cultural life in a city. And yes, museums, unfortunately, within the Indian context, we have to remember um, our general perception of a museum is very, very different from how the Western perceives visiting a museum is. Um, it is, if you were to ask my 1.1 million visitors, are they visiting a museum? Maybe half of them would say, no, I'm not visiting the museum, I'm visiting Mehrangarh Fort. The entire discussion and debate of what museum means to Indian audience needs to be re-examined as we go along. But we need to readapt to the reality. Uh, we are a cultural country. Museums are part of that cultural sector. We have an important role to play in the life of culture of people, especially in these difficult times of pandemic. We have a greater role to play. In this journey, we in 2007 started the Jodhpur RIF, the Rajasthan International Folk Festival. Uh, the fort was always a patron of arts and music, but with the festival, we formalized this relationship and marketed in a way that was meaningful, contemporary, and engaging to the audience of today. Um, People were used to hearing folk artists in a hotel, in a cultural center, but being presented as part of the festival really changed the dynamics in which we interacted with the folk artists. Uh, and similarly, in 2008, we started another festival called the World Sacred Sufi Festival, which began in Nagaur and then on to Jodhpur. And both these festivals, apart from being major platforms for folk artists, we also realized that it redefined the way people interacted with the site, the museum. It was a completely different experience than visiting the museum during the day. And as an institution, one of the strength of our philosophy has been, which we can discuss as we go on, has been that we have been an open institution. We've been open to ideas, we've been open to collaborations, we've been open to projects. We've built the right kind of infrastructure and professionalism for sustainability of these projects over the years. And I think that's where the larger context of Indian museums we have to understand that yes, there is this huge potential, but then at the end of the day, you need people. You need people to run these museums. You need people to run these cultural organizations. And until you have these professional young minds to run these museums, we will always fall short of what we dream of.
Thank you so much, Karni. Can I now request Sanjna to give your opening comments, please?
I just think that that is so critically right, Karni, what you said, and also Sanjoy, to continue from what you both have said, that I think we need to, first of all, in India, we come from such a rich cultural heritage, but I've always said that it's survived in spite of the government, and that's a pretty big miracle. But I think that we have to shift gear from simply surviving to thriving. And it's really, really frustrating, especially for the intangible arts. But if we can conceive of an India where we have these hubs, these cultural hubs, many of which can be museums, but they are run by professionally trained and charged, fired people who can actually breathe life into them, I think then we can see a sea change. And then we can actually be proud of having this rich culture, because it will be identifiable for the world to see and absorb and delight in, also for ourselves. And as Sanjoy said, it gives you us a sense of identity. But how do we do this? And I think the mammoth task in front of us lies, and one way, of course, is what Karni, your organization, has shown the path by a non-governmental museum, which has been exemplary right from the beginning and has been extraordinary and always been trying out new things, and is such an inspiration. But how can we try and forge, and MAP is an independent museum starting without any government funding or major support, but how can we also influence government thinking? Because it is a repository of some of our greatest riches. And then how can we say we have to open this up to really be welcoming and generous in its nature? I mean, the examples you've given, Sanjoy, are just shocking of the way our bronzes are kept. And this goes across the country in every level. Why is it that we have only one national museum in Delhi, or only one huge museum in Bombay, and maybe a few others, 3 or 4, we can count on maybe 2 hands? There should be in Berlin, when one walks down the streets, there are museums in every little home. Of course, I mean, 3 tiny rooms in a flat are turned into a teapot museum or into posters from the 50s. It is extraordinary. We are tangled up in such bureaucracy in this country that it is prohibitive for us to imagine that we can give birth to these tiny little museums. But our urban landscapes should be buzzing with museums. We should be able to have them without any bureaucratic entanglement and allowed to have independent museums across our urban landscapes. And frankly, I believe that if we look at India, and we see the richness that we have, and we have 730 odd, I don't know how many districts across India. Every district should be a hub for one major museum that is run fantastically and that builds the pride of the people. And if you look at the pride of those 1.3 to a million people live in each district, say, I mean, I'm not totally firm on the facts, but something like that, you would build the pride and the value of that community by actually housing a museum which would turn into this cultural hub for them and to build their value and their sense of identity and who they are. And it could be extraordinary, but it needs a mammoth shift in our view of how we can manage culture in this country from the government's view. And they don't have to do it alone, and they must not run it, because that is not the government's job. They should just allow the resources to be used by professionals for the people of India and the world. And really, I think that there's a major component to this. For me, a museum is an interpretation space. It's a space for me to interpret the past and the present, and for me to give me meaning of where I've come from, where my people have come from, and where people in another place have come from, and what they did. And I think that there have to be an incredibly important component to museums in our country that focuses on children and our youth. And we stop this typical Indian habit of visiting museums in busloads and being shepherded through and herded through dead artifacts without getting any glimpse of meaning or understanding. And I think we are shifting and changing, but it has to be on a mammoth scale. And I believe that there are audiences. I mean, for me, my great excitement was going to the Bihar Museum and seeing the children's wing there, and seeing how children could actually play and engage with the artifacts and with the ideas that were there. But then when I went years later, when it had actually opened up, and I saw school teachers taking a little, gaggle of children through the rooms, not letting them touch anything, not letting them open up any drawer, not letting them press any buttons, it just broke my heart. But that is our educational system. It's such a problem. So we have to have curated tours for schools. We have to put in that manpower. We have to build this army of cultural crusaders and warriors who will go out there and build this community that can engage in museums.
Yeah, I'm sorry to sort of interrupt. And recently India has announced a new education policy, and I think. And I think we have to redefine how we understand museums within the Indian context. It's still a very remote thought. If you think of India at the grassroots level, Sangrahalaya or a museum is still a very remote thought. So, what can the cultural atom make a difference in life of a young boy in my village? Is the starting discussion we should have.
Yeah.
No, great, Karni. So what I might do now is just invite Preeti to make her opening comments, and then we'll get to a time of discussion. But before Preeti starts, can I request the audience, either through Zoom or through Facebook, please type in your questions. I think it'll be great to hear from all of you. Please type in your questions. Preeti, can I invite you to make your comments, please?
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you, Kamini, and hello to the rest of the panelists. It's so fantastic to see all of you and be a part of this wonderful discussion. Having listened to what Sanjoy, Sanjna, and Karni have had to say, it leaves me writing, scratching my notebook, saying, oh, already said. But I speak as an artist. So I think I want to speak from where I come as a performing artist, and for me, storytelling is very important, as I think is for everybody. You know, our human race is about storytelling, and we tell stories through tangible and intangible ways. Um, and so for me, when I look at museums, I like to see them as living spaces or living organisms that are dynamic. And space for me becomes extremely important. The way I look at how do museums define space, you know, and it's not just about gallery space or where do I hang the painting space or where do I place the sculptural space, but indeed the flow of people and the kind of interactivities that happen within indoor and outdoor museums. So while there are many topics to discuss about museums, I would, from my perspective, look at two things. One is museums and the definition of space, and the other one is artists leading some of these very things that the three of you have spoken about, artists leading the educational aspect and the impact aspect in museums for intergenerational communities, how they can actually enliven the space and bring it into an absolute interactivity, which through my experience within America and in other countries where I've done some work with museums, I've seen that that is the best way of a dialogue that allows people to reflect both meditatively and as a community. So one example I will give you is that you know, I'm sort of, I see myself as a child of a museum because my mother's one of the founding directors, along with Deborah Tyagarajan and other formidable ladies of the outdoor museum, Dakshina Chitra in Tamil Nadu, outside Chennai. Even before they got the land as part of Madras Craft Foundation, I was in school and I sort of volunteered to assist some folk performing artists into urban schools in Chennai for them to actually teach urban kids about folk performing arts in villages. I had the amazing task of introducing them. I bumbled along, not knowing who they were and what it was all about. But for me as a young student then, it was a great eye-opener given the responsibility of leading another artist and introducing them to my school and school children and other schools, and to learn through that process what the exchange was, watch the excitement, and eventually write a report to the foundation that would then go into the various foundations for funding. So there was a sense of stakeholdership in this. And I think if we involve young people to take on some sort of leadership roles in museums and, and have them interact with the arts that take place and then transfer that into a learning system, there's a great opportunity for young people to look at arts that are within museums and outside, that is an easy flow between the community.
Thank you, Preeti. I think it's been great because I think everyone complemented each other in what you shared. So maybe I'll start the discussions and I'll ask the audience to type in their questions too. I've got a couple through Facebook, a couple of questions, but before that, my first question is, I think there's a perception that museums are old, or places where old and dead things are stored. If you need to change that perception and make it to be a living, vibrant places where people could go and visit. And one of the problems, in this perception is you miss out, quite a bit of the age group between 15 and 35. They don't want to go there. So I was just wondering if I can throw this to the panelists. So museums in India, if you need to kind of redefine, get people in this age group to come, make it quite lively, what would your thoughts be?
So Vinod, let me first sort of object and say that absolutely not. If you look at the Science Museum in London or the Science Museum in Paris or any of the museums perhaps outside of India, they're vibrant. It's where parents take their children. I mean, if you go to South Ken Underground Station on a Saturday or Sunday, you will have to fight your way through millions of kids. So I totally disagree that I think what we need in India, what we need to remember is that finally, we are an inherent storytelling people. Museums and the objects within museums that are hosted by museums tell stories. We forget that that's what an object and a museum is about stories. Now, if we look at that and think that every object has a story to tell, and I'll give you two quick examples, and I'm sure my other panelists will join me. So in the British Museum, one of the objects which is possibly amongst the most revered or the most precious is supposedly the thorn from the crown of Jesus Christ, which sits unobtrusively on the first floor. If you go in from the main thing, it's on the right-hand side and it's in a glass. Now, imagine that that was in the Vatican or in Jerusalem or wherever. You would have millions of people going there to prostrate, etc. But they've told a story where it's, while they're showing it as an object, they're also trying to say that this, like all the other antiquities, tell a collective story. Similarly, for example, in the British Museum, if you go to the new gallery for India opposite the Chinese galleries, you'll see everything from Filmfare to Mother India poster to etc. Look at, I mean, come back to, I don't know whether any of you, I'm sure some of you have been to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, eked out of an old a mining place, which is now a casino. It's part of a casino. Casino was told 20% of the land that you have to make into a cultural whatever. So they made this museum. You walk in, and immediately when you walk in, if you're black or brown or white, you take a different trajectory, and you come away and you have that experience of going through a particular sort of apartheid story, and it blows you away. I mean, it changes your mind, it blows you away. Similarly, in the Holocaust Museum, you have the same experience. Fast forward back here, where every street corner has a story waiting to be told. Our appreciation of history in India is either to stick a poster on it or urinate against that particular wall. Our association with history is a little confused because it's all around us. You know, it's changed from time to time. What we need to really do is say, hey, this is your neighborhood story. Be proud of it. This is your identity, your life, your world. And of course, people will come. And like Karni has done on the ramparts of Jodhpur with the Jodhpur Riff, if museums in India stop being precious and open themselves up as Raghavendra's promised to be, you will see a whole new world.
No, I agree, Sanjoy. Maybe I'll bring the other panelists in, but before I do that, just one quick comment. So what I meant in the beginning on the age group is I do agree young kids come, then parents bring the kids in, but there is a whole late teens, 20s, which is a struggle with many museums. And so that was just a clarification, but that's okay. I mean, sorry, Sanjna.
Vinod, give them a romantic place to sit. I promise you they'll come for date night.
Yes. Sanjna.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, about how a village boy from Rajasthan would want to come to the museum and feel that it was for him. I was thinking about this, about, you know, how anybody, I mean, even in Bombay, how will somebody who's got a job or works in a home or wherever want to go to a museum? And I think what we love in India, we love the bazaar, we love the mela, we love the outing. We like getting dressed up to go out. We like to go with our family. And I think that it is that excitement. It's still that excitement of dressing up and going out. Not so much in the West. In fact, my grandfather would always complain about nobody dresses up for the theater anymore. But in India, people still dress up to go to the theater. But I think that if there's that sense of ease and that sense of ease that a bazaar or a mela has, that it is for you, and it is for you to have a wonderful time, and it is for you to listen to stories and to wander into tents and see a performance, or to go into another space and get to know another story. and there is something for everybody. And also there's a playfulness that can, I think, be beautiful. And now with technology, we can play in so many ways. And it can, I mean, for children, definitely playing and imagining things is the most critical thing. And I think there's so many possibilities right
Yeah,
there.
so I would sort of, like to sort of deconstruct this. I'm a museum curator,
Of course, yeah.
so it's very close to my heart. But let me sort of deconstruct this notion of museum within the Indian context. I also come from a village, and 100 square miles from my village, there is no uh, thing as a museum. So we have to deconstruct this notion of museums within the Indian context. What we're looking at, I think what was very important in the opening statement of MAP's today's discussion is that do we have hub of creativities? They need not be museums as we understand as physical spaces. But is there a space for creative expression within my immediate community of 200 people, 300 people that I live in a small hamlet in Western Rajasthan somewhere? Um, and I think we have to sort of, start from there. And I think if that chain then comes up to how we understand museum from a very Western understanding of the notion of a museum, we'll be successful. But I think we need to have an Indian sense of uh, cultural identity and what cultural hubs are for us. What you rightly said. I mean, you walk out and each street gives you that inspiration, that idea of creativity and of engagement. So how can we leverage that living culture as spaces of living museums as we understand today? And I'll just give you one very small example and then sort of open up the discussion to the rest of the panelists. Just at the foothills of Mehrangarh Fort, there's a government school. The children there have, it's just a 200-meter walk coming into the fort and to the museum. They had never been to the fort and the museum. And when we approach the teachers that why don't you let the kids visit the museum? कि वहाँ पर क्या सीखेंगे? What will they learn? And because the whole school curriculum is so focused on a completely different perspective, and we said, okay, I mean, there's aspect of mathematics you can teach within the context of the fort. I mean, there's measurements that they can take. They can take length and breadth and calculate area, and it just opened up their imagination that they can use heritage sites and creative spaces within the context of their curriculum. But I think the fundamental point that I'm trying to make is that within the context of India's reality of its 60+% population still living in villages, this idea of museum that we are discussing needs to be deconstructed.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Can I bring Preeti in? Yep.
Yes. I just wanted to place it out there that, especially in India, to me, museums are as an extension of the community. They're not just standalone places that have to be so glorified in a way that they become exclusive and not inclusive. It's what you said, Sanjoy, that I was staring at my own notes saying about the notion of preciousness, and because for me, when I look at museums in India, what's beautiful sometimes is that when a local artist's work is represented within this large house called a museum, and so that the local community feels that they are given equal importance and they also belong to this story, and they're not outsiders to come and marvel at somebody else's art thinking that that is much more superior to what they do. So in a way, I do feel that you have your urban museums, and then you have smaller towns and rural museums. Or I don't want to use the word museum because that already sort of ossifies things in some ways for me. Maybe we should look for like Sanjoy said, if they have date nights, it'll be nice. I'm thinking maybe we need sexier definition for the word called museum. Even in the West, I live in New York, and even over here, there's a constant battle as to the redefinition of the notion called museum. One thing that I live very close to, a wonderful little museum called the Rubin Museum. It's all about the arts of the Himalayas, and they brought out a very interesting notion of the age group of young professionals. Actually, Vinod, here the drinking age being 21 and above. On Friday nights, they have what they call the K2 nights, which is great because they open up the hours of the museum to be much later, and they invite the bars open, and it's for young professionals to meet. And then they have it's a cabaret night, which means that they actually show movies. They show old movies related or in some way connected to the theme of the museum. So I have seen every Friday night, apart from the pandemic time right now, that it is buzzing with young people who normally would not think about socializing in a museum. And I'm thinking about urban centers in India where this can be, the idea of opening a bar can be pretty much controlled, So if you have the right sort of security and protocol, opening this up for youngsters to feel cool, that museum is a cool place to hang out, is a great asset for Indian museums to not feel, oh God, there's that drag. I've been dragged to this notion called museum. It could definitely foster a date night, Sanjoy, which would be great. But I think these are very important points because, how do you involve local communities not to come to how do you involve them to come to a place that we are now loosely defining as a museum, to actually look at it as a social space? Yeah. So when social space comes in, I would love, like Sanjoy said, over here, my daughter is a classic New York City kid who is constantly taken to museums, world-class museums by her school. She's entitled like all the kids in the city are. But the beauty of it is they can walk on the High Line, they can walk to the museum, where I think in villages, if there are what you call pop-up museums, I think pop-up museums are a great idea where in India, you have so many places, you involve the artisans over there to create pop-up museums where you involve local artists to come, local children to come, you have a children's gallery or their storytelling platform for children. What stories do they want to tell that are contemporary, that are impacted by what they hear from their grandparents or the nature of the space or current issues, which are land issues or inheritance issues or whatever issues there are. I mean, there are dime a dozen issues nowadays, but those become living stories. Yeah. So and now we have this amazing thing called virtual space. Instead of just leading to like Karni, just Jodhpur is now the world. Right. So I can access your museum, and through the opportunities you provide, and this is where I think artists come in. If museums can start commissioning or curating artists globally to come in and interact with, one, the artifacts you have, and but secondly also pair us with your local community artists. Let us actually have a virtual interaction, record us, create a virtual performance that can be then shared, how you've actually built these amazing virtual webs everywhere. As artists, we have to be creative thinkers. We have no choice. It's part of survival as well. But I also think we're in a great fertile period right now when institutions are shut, live theaters are shut. We have to somehow communicate. And I just think the digital space is such an important space, like how we are talking to each other right now, to excite youngsters from villages to urban centers, because these kids grow up with technology. It's not just for maths and science and homework. It's actually to create vibrant artistic exchange that a kid from somewhere, my organization, because we had to survive, we suddenly came up on this idea of creating a website on storytelling called the Red Curtain Project. And we've had stories where I've interpreted a 10-year-old's writing as a young author into bringing international artists to collaborate and create a story based on the child's story. And that the parents, suddenly they're like, oh my God, this is my child's story, has gone crazy. I didn't expect it, but it is a way that showed us a path, that how can we intergenerationally, and take away the word professional over here, because then that creates a hierarchy. A child can be brilliant at writing a story or drawing a beautiful piece of work, or an elder can come up and give you gold dust in terms of the values of life. But then when you start connecting these people from across India, from across the world, there's an excitement that builds. And suddenly your museum is not a museum anymore, it's a social space.
No, I
Which
agree that,
There's been a lot of thoughts that have come in. So maybe I'll just take this conversation a bit further. And I'd like Karni to maybe respond first, and then the other panelists join in. So, I think brilliant ideas. There's also been some questions from the audience in terms of how museums can start incorporating more of folk tales and a whole range of other things. So if a shift needs to happen in terms of museum thinking, for them to become more relevant, for them to probably get more of these intangible aspects incorporated, to reach out more to the community, so that the communities feel that this is their place. They become, more part of festivals that happen around, and et cetera, et cetera. What's the shift that's needed? And I mean, the reason I'm going to, get Karni to start with is, he works in an institution. I've been there. It's an amazing feel when you get there. 90% of museums in India, 90 or more, are going to be public institutions. But to have that shift happening, what would be needed in terms of thought process?
Well, I think one is the realization that who are you, who's your audience, and who are you catering to, and what do you want to achieve from the collection and the activities that you're doing. Traditionally, if you look at the broad Indian museum perspective and how they hire people, they hire curators, they hire, maybe a conservation staff in the conservation laboratory, um, but they probably would not hire a marketing person. They would not hire a cultural engagement person. They will not hire a social media person. They will not hire a, a fundraising person. So I think the shift needs a dramatic. There needs to be a dramatic shift in the way we hire people, and also prioritize, what our core activities are. We have to, I mean, within the Indian museum context, redefine a lot of things. We have to break a lot of walls. We have to open up to ideas, open up to collaboration, uh, be more accepting to the wider audience and wider community that you are catering to. You cannot build these large fortified walls where you will not allow scholars, you will not allow performing artists to perform in your spaces. You will not allow musicians to perform. You will not allow a social gathering in the evening, because it's a rule that after 5, nothing can happen. This 9 to 5 sort of, fixed museum timing, just to start with, needs to be completely broken.
When everybody's at work.
Yes, I mean, how can you be a social hub when you open at 9 and close at 5? it's a completely, I mean, we are completely talking in different language. We just have to sort of, unshackle ourselves and unlearn what has been sort of, told to us and defined within the Indian museum context. Through this panel discussion, everyone has said, we are a nation of great storytelling. I mean, whether it is Ramayana or Mahabharata or a local story or a Gupta sculpture or you know, the tradition of the Fard. I mean, the content is there. There is no dearth of content. But yet, I mean, we are not able to engage with our immediate audience and the audience in general because we work within a certain boundary. We have to break that boundary. We have to lose ourselves, allow more thought process to come in, allow more people to join us, allow more collaborations to happen. And once that happens, the cross filtration will happen and you will have more acceptance and more sort of, a way forward with everyone joining in and creating this beautiful world of arts and culture.
Can I
So,
can I
yeah.
say something just very quickly to what Karni said? Very short. I'm very much in the present mode of thinking like, okay, we can't actually go in to most places as we used to before. A lot of places are shut down right now. One of the thoughts for me, Karni, is based on the artist works that you have in your museum. For those who are still there with us, how wonderful would it be if you had just investment in some media and you had artists speak about their work and their process, and actually you put that on so that people understand who these people are. They're just not objects, but these are living people. And then like myself, I would get very excited to sort of watch this person and get to know the person's story, and then that would bring me in to your artifacts. And then when you open completely, come and visit your museum. I'm just thinking of more realistic ways of operating at this point, and using what we can harness, India being in such great strides with technology, and broadband and all that, the access of those things, the access of children to these kind of media, to meet artists and their works, that can then, when you open fully, brings them immediately in, so that you don't have to worry about the sort of false timings at this point, because yes, 9 to 5 is quite ridiculous. But then with the global digital world, timing is pretty much irrelevant. So I'm just throwing that out as the possibilities of museums in India, harnessing that and getting corporations like corporate companies with their CSR to sort of help you create this sort of other world and hub for your local areas, and then extend beyond.
Can I step in
Absolutely.
just now? I mean, I think before I pass to the other panelists, so we have about 15 minutes left. So if you can keep your answers quite short, maybe 30 seconds.
I just want to say one thing very briefly. The Chhatrapati Shivaji through Sangrahalaya, erstwhile Prince of Wales Museum in Bombay, has done an extraordinary job with trying to change its entire image and trying to make itself felt as a space for the people that really come there. And I think that's the thing, to make people feel that they really are thought of, that you are thought of. I know that when I came to Mehrangarh, I knew I was thought of, because I knew that you had a space I could leave my husband while I went traipsing around with your wonderful audio guide for an hour and 50 minutes, and he would not get hassled in the heat because he was taken care of with a glass of beer in your cafe. But I think it's essential, where I can put a child, my son, I can put him away in a workshop while I look at stuff. But the Prince of Wales Museum has done, the CSMVS Museum in Bombay has brought in children. It's got a whole children's wing where the children feel it's their space. Immediately they walk in and they know it's their space. Not only that, they've curated things. They've done a workshop where children have curated their own exhibition from the artifacts of the museum. I mean, it's just an extraordinary thing. we partnered with them as Junoon, and we started bringing performances and performers once a month. The challenge for us, which was our next phase, well, one time, maybe some point in my life, is what I want to do is I want to challenge artists, as you say, Preeti, to really work with the museum content-wise and idea-wise, and then with the audience to see how that can be brought alive. And I think there's so much that we can do. And it's happening slowly, but it has to happen on a mammoth scale.
Yeah. So maybe I'll bring Sanjay into this discussion. Sanjay, maybe taking it a bit further. You know, you've done so many festivals, and I mean, where do you see museums fit when you do a broader festival?
So I just wanted to, I'll answer that. I just wanted to do 3 quick points. One is that going back to what Karni said, what we need is museum administrative people who understand how museums have to be run. 2, government has no business being in museums. If you look at the difference between the Mehrangarh Museum and say the Udaipur Palace Museum, and you look at say even the National Museum, Mehrangarh invites you in. Every room that you go to is vibrant. Same with Udaipur. The National Gallery has an inch of dust. Every time I go to see Raghavendra, I go hysterical. I'm like, I am allergic, you know, and blah, blah, blah. Governments should get out of museums. Give the money to the museums, stay out of its administration. They have neither passion nor vision. We can't expect them to. Let's move beyond that. Third, as you said, Vinod, you know, the sad thing, I mean, you know, we're talking about storytelling, and I saw a question. For 25 years, we've been after government to create something for independence, a museum of independence where you tell your stories. And of course, we've supported Kishwar and Malika in creating the Museum of Independence in Amritsar. But here it comes back to what you said. How do festivals and museums come together? Can we relook at what we call a museum? Can we say, is Hampi, for example, a museum? Of course it is. You know, is Kanchipuram a museum? Of course it is. You know, so I mean, in the same way that Mehrangarh and Udaipur and many of these people on their own personal sort of vision have created incredibly interesting, inviting spaces. Aditya Arya, who's created the Museo Camera, the music or the sound museum in Bangalore, the new science museum that's coming up in Bangalore. All of these are examples of what can become a model for the future. How do festivals work? I mean, for example, with the Science Museum in Bangalore, this was one of the first things that Tata Institute and we got together because, you know, between LSE and blah, 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 everybody came together and said, Sanjay, tell us how can we create this? And we put out an agenda. We said it can't just be a one-off. It has to be like what we do with Science Museum in the UK or what's it called, Earth in Edinburgh. Preeti, I forget its name, the Science Center in Edinburgh. Anyway, you know, there it's not just, I mean, the festival is the resulting process of a lot of work and activity. It's like what Preeti is saying or Sanjna is saying or Karni is saying. You have to do things regularly. You have to work with storytellers and artists and local communities and so on and so forth. And we must remind ourselves that if you look at the footfall, as Karni said in the beginning of the thing, people go there, families go there, locals go there, people who are visiting Jodhpur, not just the white or the rich or the middle class like us. All kinds of people go there. Why? Why don't they come to Delhi and go to the National Museum, but they go to the Indira Gandhi, whatever, the memorial place. They go to Teen Murti. We have to rethink of how we are doing this, and the roadmap exists. It's not about reinventing the wheel. The world over, museums have reinvented the wheel, look to the future, look to technology, had a happy mix, including, as Sanjana said, CVMS, etc., and have moved forward. For that, you need good governance. Just one thing. All of this other will fall into place. Festivals, storytellers, blah, blah, blah. Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal, one of the best tribal art
Yeah.
museums in recent times. Vinod, please go there. I would urge everybody to go there.
It's
Being built
fantastic.
with passion.
So,
Where are the storytellers? Where are the performers?
Sanjay,
Make that happen.
yeah, I'll just take the discussion a bit further. So, talking about arts, how can museums help in building a strong arts ecosystem in the local community around them? So I'll ask, any of the panelists to
Well,
comment.
it's about interpretation. A museum surely is not, it's about interpreting the past. And it does it through things it has. But what can bring that other layer of understanding is all the intangibles that can go with it. And I think that's what the arts community can build into it. But I mean, again, it's, we're such a resource crunched world, but more than resource crunched, I think what we've all been saying is that we've got prohibitive laws and regulations and bureaucratic systems. But I think that's my take on it. Is that
I think I'm going with what Sanjna is saying. I think also listening to what Sanjoy said, for me, museums to be living spaces and social spaces, particularly when you're talking about the museum in Bombay, in Mumbai, Sanjana, it's so fantastic to hear about children having their own spaces. So there are safe spaces, where people can allow themselves to be vulnerable. And I think vulnerability is removed from the equation. And I think museums to be living spaces really need to redefine themselves as a space for social and emotional health. Right now, so many people are going through so many things. To see the museum as a space that they could come and relax and do what they need to do and not feel pressured to know everything or be knowledgeable. The sense of, if you remove the idea of elitism away from museums, I really think, local people will come in much more than, urban elites in a way, because, there's a completely community-centered feeling from local communities. And I think that redefinition, that even involving local organizers to rethink of the space as their space and how can they make it better, that sort of involvement, where even if they have one or two ideas, that participatory ideas would bring them to feel that they've had an impact in the space. And I think that immediately to me is dynamic, which allows them to then talk to their people and bring them in. Now, talking about bureaucracy and governments, interestingly, I just wonder if some of the government curators themselves could be led through a docent program, where how do we view these things to bring in modern generations? How do we get the spouses involved in a way that could involve them in some sort of a role in the museums? I don't mean like a job creation. I just mean in terms of their creative input. You don't have to be a professional artist to give ideas. And they might have a lot, but feel inhibited in some ways to speak about it because they feel a sort of distancing that happens. You come and you watch and you appreciate it, and then you go away feeling good. But what about the other way of you're invited to come and be part of the discussion table and then actually implement simple, just very simple one or two ideas brought about by the local people, then that they can see that it's been implemented by local houses, which can, like Sanjana said, could be the small museums or the centers, and which I think would be lovely to have pop-up museums. And those would be very creative ideas to bring in because they then become safe spaces, right? They become, take care of you and the community and vice versa. So there's an investment there.
So we're getting nearly close to the time when we got to wind up. So what I'm going to do with each of the panelists is, if you can stress on one aspect you think would be good for Indian museums to do, going forward, what would that be? I know a lot of ideas were shared. So I just want you guys to just pick one that, would be the topmost thing. So maybe I'll start with if you want to be the first person to go, and then we'll just move on. Karni, you're there. You're on. I think you're on mute.
No, I again would like to go back to grassroots. I work in a pure museum environment, but I am aware of the the immediate cultural world around me. And um, we talked about storytelling. We talked about the various mediums which engages the audience to local culture. And I think that's where the heart and soul lies. Museum necessarily doesn't need to be the only mechanism to serve that purpose. Indian culture, through the generation and through the times, have had its own ways in which this tradition has continued. And I think if there's a realization that how we can support that ecosystem to work, simple thing of a village chopal, the storytelling tradition in a family context, in a village context. Is that happening? Is that not happening? What we can do to support that ecosystem, and that is the responsibility of the larger, the museum world that we represent. Unfortunately, there are too many, other elements that are coming in way of that process of communication uh, of the traditional knowledge system between the elders and the new generation. And if you are able to support that continuity of culture, I think continuity of culture is very important. And if larger institutions can support that, I think there would be a far-reaching effect. And I personally feel, being a sort of a thorough museum professional working in a typical museum environment, that we have to deconstruct within the Indian context, what Indian museums represent, and what the responsibility and role they can play in this humongous country that is India.
Thanks, Karni. Maybe Sanjna, you want to?
Well, I just think that we have to create a complete bureaucratic shift and change, like Sanjoy was also saying, and I said earlier that the government needs to step out. It needs to say these are the resources. This is what our treasure is. This treasure trove that we have, which is also land, space, building, infrastructure, but also richness of what is there. And they need to be enablers. They need to just create enabling systems to enable private citizens who are professionals in the field. And we do have to have professionals also. I mean, this is also about a certain academia. There is a certain professionalism. This is about the truth, historic truth, not simple storytelling interpretation alone. I mean, there are a lot of things here. And I think the government needs to just walk away, handing this treasure trove to people who know what they're doing. And I've said that, and I don't believe it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I hope it does.
Thanks, Sanjna. Sanjoy, you want to give your closing comments?
I think Karni represents everything that we've been talking about right now as what a good curator with a good vision can bring about. What we need are good curators, knowledgeable, impassioned, good administrators, leaders, and like I said, people with a vision. You put that into place, make sure that you choose well, the rest of it is easy. Do you know, Vinod, that today in the government of India, in its new plans for museums, etc., they do not have a category to pay for a curator. You can tender for remaking, cleaning up, whitewashing, dusting, blah, 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 but you cannot appoint a curator. That is the fact. So I wish the government of India looks to people like Karni and his ilk, and there are so many of them. Why is
It'll
Madhu
happen
Ghosh
through the
sitting?
states. It'll happen through the
Yeah,
states. It's not
why
going to
is
happen
Madhu
through the
Ghosh
center.
sitting in AIC, in Arts Institute Chicago? Why are these wonderful people in
Yeah.
MoMA or Field Museum or anywhere in the world? All of them can find a place here and build what Karni has done in Jodhpur. That's a living example. We don't have to look elsewhere. It's successful, it's private, it makes its money, it brings in people, it's open, it's accessible, it works with local communities, and most importantly, it tells a story. It anchors us. It gives us a home. It tells us about our ancient traditions. It allows us an access and a window into a world of history, philosophy, knowledge, and so much more. That's what we are as human beings, right?
Thanks, Preeti.
I agree with all three of you, and I just wanted to add that I think museums are corridors of time, and also they're an extension of the community. So connecting from ancestral to contemporary, I think is a very important role of museums. And I think there are two things I want to just add to this is the role of the digital world, and not to undermine that, and how powerful that can be to connect this kind of corridor that I'm talking about. The other one is artist involvement. For museums in India to seriously start investing in local artists around them, you don't have to look very far; they're just there. And once you start bringing them in bit by bit, you start building, a wonderful community right there that can keep extending as an example to other centers and therefore have a great snowballing effect. So I would say artists and the digital media, because you're working on amazing corridors, and India's always played with that idea of time in any case.
So thank you so much, all panelists. I think what you brought in is a rich mix of ideas. I think there's been so many ideas shared during this discussion. See, from my perspective, having worked in so many different contexts, um, I've seen all kinds of museums. I mean, you go into the Pacific Islands, they don't even call it a museum, they call it a cultural center, so that the community could feel strongly that they are part of it. But one thing is common that I see in most institutions is most institutions are not funded 100% by the government, because then the drive is not there. Usually it could be anything between 20 to 60, 70%. So there's a strong drive then to go get audiences to make it more creative, et cetera, et cetera. And I've got a lot of optimism about museums in India. I think Raghavendra, he's doing a fantastic job, and I think I think things like this panel, the ideas that are put forth, I think some of that, if they are incorporated, would make the museum community even richer. Thanks to Kamini, to Abhishek, and the great work that MAP and the team is doing. Thank you all so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a fascinating evening, and
Yes.
thank you for all your sort of inputs. And I think we have a very bright future as far as India and culture is concerned.